So today's presentation is about intergenerational connections in terms of dealing with the environment. Very brief introductions. It's intergenerational. We'll start with Sarah. Sarah Karp, she, her, is a high school junior and Massachusetts-based climate organizer, currently focused on the intersection between climate change and our schools. Sarah was first introduced to the Massachusetts climate movement as a 2022 fellow for the climate policy organization Our Climate, where, among other things, she led the writing and campaign process for Massachusetts state climate education bill. Currently, Sarah works at Mass Audubon as an organizer for the Massachusetts Climate Resilient Schools Coalition, which works with students, teachers, and community members to catalyze local policy for climate education and clean school infrastructure. Tom Rollins, or Rawson. Tom Rawson is a recently retired 7th and 8th grade science teacher and an MTA Climate Action Network member. He leads courses on climate change for adults, works on climate change education and activism with a variety of groups, including Massachusetts Audubon and Elders Climate Action, is an En-ROADS Climate Ambassador, co-chairs the Third Act Massachusetts Finance and Pension Team. His environmental interests began with work on the campus for the first Earth Day in 1970. His interest in climate change grew beginning about 15 years ago when he started teaching it to 8th graders. Before becoming a teacher, Tom ran his own software business for many years. He spends his free time doing carpentry, bicycle riding, hiking, sailing when he can. And finally, Ferd Walken is chair of the MTA Climate Action Network and retired from the UMass Labor Center. So I turn it over to you guys. Go ahead.
There we go. Okay, so Sarah and I and Ferd may have a few little things more to say to introduce ourselves. So I don't know, maybe we should do this as a little Q&A. Sarah, do you want to say more about how you got started in all this?
Sure,
This is going
yeah.
to be a very conversational
Of
presentation.
course, yeah. So I obviously have not been doing this for an incredibly long time. I first got involved my freshman year. I mean, I've always been like pretty, I would say, politically active, and like I don't know, I like did text banking around the 2020 elections and like made lots of phone calls. But I really got involved in climate my freshman year, doing kind of local policy around like my town climate action plan. I go to school at Acton Boxborough Regional High School. And then I sort of got involved in like the statewide movement, which just, we'll talk more about this later, but is just kind of like the collection of many climate organizations that young people are a part of across the state, and sort of gradually found this like niche within schools and within climate education. And so did that with legislation at the state level for a year. And then I'm kind of back doing like statewide organizing campaigns, but that are geared towards sort of organizing in local communities in a much more kind of grassroots way. So yeah, I'll maybe pass it back to you, Tom. Obviously you are the expert on yourself and your own story. And so would love to kind of just hear your take in your own words a little bit.
So my story is, as Patrick said, I started doing this a really long time ago in 1970, when our kind of action on campus was we were science types, and we calculated how much sulfur dioxide the campus heating plant was putting into the air and published our findings and worked to get people to shift things. And that was kind of the beginning of my environmental involvement. And then really climate change is something that I picked up as a teacher. And I would say It's been a very interesting trajectory. At the beginning of teaching about climate change 15 years ago, we had to work really hard to find material that was useful for our students. And by the time I retired a few years ago, we had to work really hard to curate the material because there was so much. It really shifted. And so it was a great thing to be working on at the end of my career. And my goal in retirement was to do climate change education and activism, so that's what I've been doing. And maybe we should hear a little bit from Ferd about what your trajectory has been.
Well, it's a rather long trajectory, so I won't go into all of it, but I got politically active in the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, and my passion has always been where the labor movement and other progressive movements intersect, whether that's feminism or anti-racism or anti-imperialism. But some number of years ago, it became really clear that climate was the overarching issue of our times, and I was especially inspired by youth. I went to the big climate march in New York, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago, and then on the UMass campus, students were fighting for the university to divest from fossil fuels, and I just got really inspired. I worked on the divestment campaign, and then having been an MTA member and now a retired MTA member, it seemed like this is a large and powerful union, and we should be doing climate activism in the MTA. So that's where I've really been focused. I chair MTA's investment committee, and we've divested from fossil fuels. And as was mentioned, I work with the Climate Action Network in MTA.
So we were going to start out with sort of trying to kind of go through what's the problem and what can be and is being done about it. And I think Sarah's going to talk a little bit about the basics of all this. So like what is the problem working on?
Yeah. So I think kind of everyone who showed up today, I think we all can kind of like acknowledge that, you know, the climate is warming. It's real, it's around us, like we're seeing the effects right now, in kind of, you know, increased storms, weird things that are happening with the weather, like even here in Massachusetts. And you know, so I think that I really do, I don't want us to kind of skip over the step of like grounding kind of in that concern that is very real. And we're kind of seeing the effects, I think, pick up. And sort of, I know, you know, I'm definitely on the like news circuit of like all of the sort of dire news about climate change. And you know, we also know that the sort of impacts of climate change are not proportionate, like they're sort of not shared equally among everyone. And so, you know, we're looking at disproportionate impacts on, you know, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, low income communities, countries in the global South that are less developed. And you'll probably hear me throw around the term environmental justice somewhat today, and sort of environmental justice communities, which just means there are a lot of different sort of legal and cultural definitions of what that means. But kind of generally for our purposes, environmental justice communities are those communities that I just talked about, who are going to kind of bear the brunt of this crisis and bear disproportionate impacts. However, I'm not just going to talk at you about like how horrible this is, because that would be a waste of your time and a waste of my time. There is a lot of hope. You know, a majority of US people in the US are either alarmed or concerned about climate change. That number is even higher when we look at kind of, you know, worldwide groups of people. And so people really do care about this. I think in a lot of ways we have moved past like, you know, this stage of like trying to shift the narrative to get people to care about it. That being said, there definitely are kind of a small minority, less than 10% of Americans who talk about, you know, actually denying the effects of climate change. And those people are a very small minority, and they're also very loud. And so that's why it's really important to actually sort of mobilize folks that do care. We know that in the US, while about 1 in 3 people are alarmed, say that they're alarmed about climate change, only about 9% of those folks are actually active in a group that's fighting climate change. And so there's a lot of room for kind of you to come in and help us rewrite this narrative, and, you know, help us take sort of these statistics to a very real and concrete place, and to talk about sort of what that can mean, and kind of concretely, Tom, like what work needs to be done. I would love for you to sort of elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Somebody put a little question in the Q&A about what the percent of CO2 is in the atmosphere, and that's an easy answer. The actual percentage is very small. It's, I believe if I'm doing the math right, it's 0.04% roughly at the moment, but it should be 0.03%. It's 300, it's about 400 parts per million, 420, and it should really be about 350. That's so the actual percentage is very small, but the impact is big. So what needs to be done about these problems? There are a couple of big categories of things that need to be done. And in climate change work, we talk about these often with 2 words: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about not putting the CO2 or other gases that cause warming into the atmosphere. It's stop putting them in, take them out if we can. It's about reducing the greenhouse gases that are causing the warming. And the basic idea of what has to happen for a lot of that is stop burning stuff. You know, that's the shorthand. Fossil fuels, wood, but mostly fossil fuels. There are other sources of greenhouse gases, particularly so-called natural gas, methane gas, some agricultural sources, and so on. But the biggest contributor is we burn stuff. We burn gas, we burn oil, we burn coal, and that's where it comes from. And that's what's called mitigation. And it's a global effort. And mitigation is a global problem because, among other things, the CO2 doesn't stay where it's emitted. It travels all over the globe. And it's particularly, I'm just going to go back to something Sarah said, the low-income communities in low-income countries bear the brunt of the problem, but they are not the source of the problem. Much of those emissions are coming from more developed countries because that's what drove the development. So each country is contributing, but more the higher income and more developed countries. And that's a big piece of what we need to work on, is just, you know, reduce. And there are lots of ways that can happen. There are lots of ways to reduce the CO2 emissions. The sort of big picture of that people talk about has 2 parts. Electrify everything that you can, and green the grid, meaning the production of remove the fossil fuels from the production of electricity and produce them from renewable sources. And if the electricity is coming from renewable sources and then the energy we're using is electric, that takes a big chunk out of the fossil fuels. And what that means is different in different sectors. Transportation is, you know, personal transportation is one thing, home heating and cooling is another, commercial transportation is another. There's lots of pieces to consider, but that's the basic idea of what needs to be done, is a lot more electrification and a lot more renewable sources of energy. And then there's lots of littler pieces. The other piece is what we call adaptation or resilience. You'll hear us talk later about the group that Sarah is staffing called Climate Resilient Schools in Massachusetts. That's part of where that word comes in. And that's about, we're not going to turn off all the fossil fuels tomorrow and pull the atmosphere back from 420 parts per million to 350. So we're going to have impacts from climate change. And adaptation is about minimizing those impacts, particularly on the people most impacted, most affected. And adaptation, in contrast to mitigation, is very much local. What one community needs to do to adapt to climate change is different from what the next one needs. The local conditions are different. So in a city, a key adaptation thing might be tree planting, because tree planting turns out not to do as much as you might hope for CO2, but it does a lot for the temperature during a heat wave in an urban area. Whereas another community might have lots of trees, but be concerned about flooding, et cetera, et cetera. And so the adaptation part of what we need to do is local. And you'll hear us talk about this more later, but if you're looking for things to do, there's often really a lot that can be done in your local community on both of these fronts, but particularly adaptation. Another piece that adds on to these is talk about it. A lot of people, the data is very well researched data, shows that lots of people are concerned. Sarah gave you the numbers, but very few people talk about climate change, even though they're concerned. Part of that is because they're afraid that percentage of deniers is bigger than it actually is. So they're afraid somebody's going to yell at them. And statistically, at least, you don't have to worry about that as much as you might think. But talking about it is really important and helpful. And there's lots of people who will think things through better if they have a chance to talk more about it, and it's more of a live issue. And there's a great video. I don't think we put the link in the links, but that we gave to Sarah, but we can send it, from a woman named Catherine Hayhoe. She's the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and the title of the video is "The Most Important Thing You Can Do About Climate Change is Talk About It," because it helps people get active. And the other thing I will say, I mentioned it once already, is that people often don't realize how much work is local, and how much can be done in your local community. And my favorite example of this is, one of the things that really needs to happen is that we need to stop building more fossil fuel infrastructure. And around here, when we talk about fossil fuel infrastructure, people think, oh, refineries in Louisiana and Texas. But that's not really what we're talking about around here. We're talking about LNG terminals in Everett, and the Weymouth compressor station, and the pipeline that somebody wants to build. There's so much that can be done locally. And that's important to remember, because you can do it through the connections you already have and the people you already know. So I don't know, Sarah, do you want to add anything else to that?
I think you got it. Yeah, organizing is all about, how can we leverage the connections that we have? And I think, yeah, the best way to start is with that, and is with building community as you go. So yeah.
If I could just add a couple quick things.
Go for it.
One is, I've taken to trying to not use the term climate change, which sounds somewhat neutral, and I talk about global heating, and that just sounds more like, oh my God, we got to do something about it. And the other thing, in terms of what can people do, there's so many things that people can do as individuals, and some of them are easy and some of them are hard, but it also leads to people feeling kind of guilty if they're not doing them. And so I think my focus, and the MTA Counts focus, really is on institutions. you know, what can the government do? What can corporations do? What can school districts do? And so I think it's really important to keep that focus there.
I just want to add one little thing to that as a former middle school teacher teaching climate change, is that this is something we paid a lot of attention to, because we really didn't want our students to think that the fact that they didn't turn the lights off was responsible for climate change. And we wanted them to see the systemic nature of it. And that's really important to keep in mind. So, I don't know, Sarah, you want to start this next piece? There's a lot of people doing something about this already.
Yeah, for
We're going
sure.
to tell you about a lot of them.
So yeah, I would love to kind of just give a little bit of info on sort of what the landscape of people that are working on climate looks like right now. So there are over 2,000 like groups that are like established with names worldwide, and over 200 in the US, and that's not counting kind of all of the different local teams and groups, which is a lot. And then in Massachusetts, if I can I just want to kind of quickly share this graphic right here. This is a map of, I would say that this is only about 50% of all of the organizations that are working on climate in Massachusetts right now. And so you can kind of see that we have all of these different organizations. This map is showing various coalitions, which that's just like a group of organizations that's coming together, and kind of their relationships with other coalitions. And so you can see here, this is the Massachusetts Youth Climate Coalition, of which I am the part of. There's Our Climate MA right there. That's the organization that I worked for. And Our Climate also has relationships with the Mass Power Forward Coalition, which is this is the largest climate coalition in Massachusetts, mostly adult-led organizations. And then you can also see, you know, the Green Justice Coalition. The point of showing this map is not to kind of overwhelm everybody with like, oh my gosh, there's so many people doing so many things, but really just to sort of give you a sense of like the scale and the intricacies of this movement, right? And so a thing that I tell young people a lot when we're kind of talking about how to get involved, is, you know, yes, show up to meetings, show up to organizations, like, you know, put yourself out there. And also, like, if you show up to a meeting and you're like, these are not my people, I don't like it here, chances are there are 75 other climate organizations that you also could be involved in. And so yeah, I think it kind of, you know, navigating that map is all about just going with sort of where you feel drawn and feel passionate. We're gonna talk now a little bit about sort of some of the intergenerational dynamics. And interestingly enough, we talk a lot about the youth climate movement. Young people are, you know, the most concerned and the most likely statistically to be involved in sort of climate advocacy. And then also, like, right kind of next in line with that, there's sort of this whole like elders climate movement, that exists, I think is like, I would say is very strong in Massachusetts. Sort of elders as a demographic are the second most likely to be active in climate policy and climate advocacy after young people. And so just kind of to talk a little bit about some youth climate organizations in Massachusetts, as you saw on that map, MIC, or the Massachusetts Youth Climate Coalition, is a collection of kind of student-led organizations that come together and they plan events and they work on state legislation and they do lots of things. Our Climate is kind of one of the convening organizations of the Massachusetts Youth Climate Coalition. They just have sort of the most staff capacity. And they're a national organization that trains young people across the country to do climate policy, and to advocate for climate policy. We also have Sunrise, which is, I think, of all of the organizations on this list, if you're familiar with any of them, Sunrise will probably be that organization. Sunrise is the largest youth climate advocacy organization in the country. It's huge. I was a Sunrise member. I think every young person that is working in climate has like gone through Sunrise and worked with Sunrise at some point. They are currently doing a lot of really cool work on schools. So I definitely would recommend checking out their current like Green New Deal for Schools campaign, because it's very cool. And then sort of moving back into Massachusetts, we also have people at Spring Forward that are doing kind of climate curriculum and climate education stuff. And then we also have Mass Audubon, which is the organization that I work for currently. Not a youth-led organization, but they have a lot of youth programs, and there are a lot of kind of high school students that are involved in their various like climate leadership programs. I will pass it over to Tom to talk a little bit about sort of elders, climate orgs, and sort of what they're up to. Yeah.
Sure. And just a couple of things to prefix that. One is all the organizations that we're talking about, we sent links for those and a whole lot of other useful resource links to Sarah, and she has already made those available and will be sending you the links to them. So if you see that and go, oh, wait a minute, what's that Mass Power Forward? That's in there. So you don't have to worry about picking that up right now. And well, let me tell you about the organizations first, and then I have one other comment I want to make. So there's two major organizations doing climate work with elders, with retirees, generally. And what Sarah said is right. Massachusetts is a particularly active state in this regard. The two that I'm talking about are Elders Climate Action, which has been around for a while. It's most active historically in Massachusetts and California. It's part of a larger group called Elders Action Network that works on other issues besides climate, but Elders Climate Action is particularly climate. The Massachusetts focus of ECA is mostly legislative and educational. So there are a lot of educational programs. Really, there's pretty much something every week, and monthly meetings. And there's a team that knows a lot about what's going on in the legislature and helps with other environmental organizations to support bills there. They analyze them pretty carefully. And lots of opportunities to get involved there. And I'm a member of Elders Climate Action. I'm not super active, but I've done a few things there. And some of us teach some classes for adults, which came out of the education team of Elders Climate Action, although it's now independent. The other group is Third Act, which, like the broader group 350.org, was started by the well-known climate activist Bill McKibben. And it's focused on climate, justice, and democracy. Those are the three pieces that Third Act works on. It's active all over the country. There are about 70,000 members. There's a very active Massachusetts chapter that I've been involved in, the part of the Massachusetts chapter that's working on pensions and finances, because like probably most people here, we're public pension beneficiaries, and the pension funds are not clean in terms of fossil fuels. So there's work being done on that. There's a bill in the legislature and so on. But Third Act is broader. Third Act works on advocacy. They're working on private jets at Hanscom. They're working on democracy and get out the vote efforts and so on. And both of those groups, one of the things I will say, just going back, we'll talk more about what you can do when we get a little further toward the end of the presentation. But both of those groups are very easy to get involved in, and there's people all over the state working on them. And there's a lot, I would say they're growing, especially Third Act is growing very quickly. As Sarah said, there's a lot of interest among elders in working on climate, and lots of ways to plug into that. So I'll say one other thing, and then I think Ferd's going to talk a little bit about MTA and unions in this space and MTA Climate Action Network. But I just wanted to say one thing. This is something Sarah and I talked about when we were planning. I remember my first political activism, which was around the Vietnam War. And probably some of you remember that too. And I remember the way things were structured, and that we as youth were certainly involved, but the leadership of the groups we worked with, the campaigns we worked on, was all adults. And that's really different in the climate movement. And really a big positive change is that there's so much youth leadership. And Sarah's giving you a little bit of picture of that, but I would say it's rare, maybe doesn't happen at all to see a climate coalition that doesn't involve youth activists and youth leadership. And it's really a shift from what things were like when I learned political activism, and I think a very positive one that's really benefiting everybody. So that's a really good thing. And I think, I don't know the country as well, but in Massachusetts, certainly youth play a big role in the climate movement to all of our benefit. So Ferd, you want to talk a little bit about MTA and?
Sure. So we're all members of the MTA. We were all active members when we were working, and now we're retired members. So MTA CAN is what I'll call it for short, Climate Action Network, consists of active educators, retired people, K through 12, higher ed. It's not an official committee of the MTA because there are a lot of very restrictive things about what it means to be a committee, but we have tremendous support from the MTA board and the MTA elected leadership. So the group started a number of years ago, originally just some individuals who brought forth NBIs, new business items, to MTA annual meeting. But it's really expanded well beyond that and is trying to build a real grassroots movement in the MTA with the idea that MTA should look at all its work through the lens of climate, just like it should look at all our work through the lens of race. So a few pieces of just sort of the theory behind CAN. Of course, it's because of the existential nature of the crisis. We don't have to talk more about that. But there's a particular role that educators can play because we work with students. Students, as we've heard, are really in the leadership of the youth movement, but can certainly benefit from good relationships with teachers and other adults. Educators are generally very well respected by their communities. Educators can work with student clubs in schools, be an interface between students and administration if need be. And also really important that as union members, we want to bring labor issues into the climate movement, just like we want to bring climate issues into the labor movement. And what I mean by that is you've probably heard the term just transition, or as Sarah talked about, climate justice. We want to make sure as we transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, that workers in those fields are not hurt. And communities, indigenous communities and so forth, aren't hurt. So we want to make sure that there's a labor presence in the climate movement. And then finally, in terms of sort of the theory, the power of the MTA, it's the largest union in New England. We have members in every state rep and state senate district. We're a powerful force at the state house. We're a leader among various labor coalitions in the state. So what MTA does really matters. So what does CAN actually do? We have a mailing list of about 400, 450 people. There's a coordinating committee of like 6 to 8 people. It changes from month to month. But people are working on curriculum. So on the website, which will send links out, there's so much out there in the way of curriculum. People talked about Mass Audubon has done things, a lot of groups have, but there's a committee of CAN that's sort of vetting climate curricula. Supporting youth activists. Sarah mentioned the interdisciplinary climate education bill. We've been working in support of that. We look at collective bargaining, our contracts. People don't often think of that, but there's a lot that can be done in bargaining, and some MTA locals are now starting to bring climate issues into bargaining. We have a group working on food waste and how to minimize that. Tom mentioned the pension fund, the state employees and teachers pension fund, and insurance companies, both MTA and the state, have all sorts of insurance, most of which is with some really dirty insurance companies. So we're in the process right now, actually, of setting up a meeting with the state treasurer who chairs the pension fund to see. And the pension fund has actually begun moving in a little bit of a better direction, as has the Mass School Building Authority, which used to be terrible. That's the state body that provides funding for both for new schools, but also for renovations. And its history has been like, oh, you need a new boiler, we'll give you a gas-fired boiler rather than looking at heat pumps. And that's beginning to change, and we want to really push the state. So we're meeting both with the state auditor and the treasurer. We do work inside the MTA like this, we present at workshops, we table at events. We succeeded in getting MTA to divest its own funds from fossil fuels. MTA has a considerable reserves, around $70–80 million. We've brought a number of new business items, one of which is to set up a decarbonization task force in the MTA to look at MTA's operations, the buildings that it either owns or rents, transportation, so forth, and developing a plan which will be brought back to the board and the MTA annual meeting as to how MTA can, put its money where its mouth is around this. I was going to talk a little about coalitions, but I know we're going to do that separately, and the Climate Resilient Schools Coalition that I think Sarah and Tom are going to talk about, but MTA CAN was instrumental in being a bridge between the founders of that group and the MTA leadership, so that MTA is now a member of that. And I won't spend much more time, but there's a lot of things that MTA retirees can do, and a lot's been mentioned already, but it's participating in this coalition. We'll talk about how that can happen, coming to conferences. We also have started doing Zoom events, and we'd love to see more locals forming climate committees to take on whatever the work in their buildings or their district is. And retirees who still have connections with their old locals can certainly play a role and have a little bit more time than people currently teaching. So anyway, there's lots more to say, but I'll stop there.
Tom, can I interrupt a second? This is Dale. There was a question posed about whether or not there is an official divestment committee within the MTA.
There is not an official divestment committee in the MTA. There's an investment committee which monitors the reserves of the MTA. I actually chair that group. But that's the answer, I think.
I was just gonna add one little thing to something to what Ferd said, which is in the links that are sent out, you will also see a link to the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is kind of the national hub for labor and climate work, and where this is going on in other places. And what Ferd said about coalitions, I think, goes right to what we're gonna talk about next, or really what Sarah's gonna talk about next. So you wanna,
Yeah.
how do we do all this work?
Yeah. So yeah, we've just kind of thrown at you like a whole list of various organizations that are like, operating at the state level, at the national level, students, teachers, elders. And I think, something that obviously I, as an organizer, think about a lot and spend a lot of my time kind of working through, is okay, we have all of these organizations. Now what? How do those organizations actually do good work? How do they make change? How do they change policy? How do they run campaigns? And at least the answer that I am really passionate about to that question is that we do this work through coalitions. And so a coalition, just like can be a collection of official organizations, also can be just like a kind of larger network of people that are maybe involved in different organizations. And coalitions are such an amazing tool because they help bridge gaps. And so coalitions can bridge the gap between the youth movement and the elder movement. They can bridge the gap between students and teachers. And I would say that at least in Massachusetts, little gets done without coalitions. Like pretty much every sort of major legislative win, every campaign win was supported by a broad coalition of people and organizations that sort of help us mobilize resources and power from a lot of different places. And so I would love to just talk sort of briefly about kind of to illustrate an example of this. Currently, I work to help organize the Climate Resilient Schools Coalition, which is something that I, over the summer, helped found along with some other adults at Mass Audubon and at this other organization, Undaunted K-12, which looks at infrastructure in schools and how to kind of make our infrastructure net zero. And the Climate Resilient Schools Coalition at the moment is a collection of students and teachers and administrators. The MTA is an official member, thanks, as Ferd mentioned, to a lot of hard work on the part of MTA Can to make that happen. And we advocate for something called a climate resolution or a school board resolution, which essentially is a piece of, it's a time-bound commitment that is written by students and teachers and, parents and community members in school districts. And then that piece, those commitments to green energy and to climate curriculum are brought forth before the school committee where they are voted on. And if a resolution is kind of affirmed, if it is like implemented, it helps us institutionalize some of the change that we want to see in school districts. And so I think, I obviously am biased because I help run it. But I do think that, this coalition is a really fabulous opportunity for people that are looking to work kind of specifically at the intersection of, schools and climate. And I think, too, because it is a coalition, it's very, very easy to be involved in, this coalition as a member of Third Act or as, a member of MTA Can. And we, are really focused on kind of trying to remove silos within the movement. We do not want people to be siloed and isolated in this work. We want people to be gathered in community with each other, because when we feel good and we feel supported about the work that we're doing, the work we do is better. So I will just put in the chat. This link is also in the link slides that will be sent out. But this is our kind of coalition interest form. If you are someone that feels excited about organizing in your local community around this, fill it out, and I or someone else from my team will get back to you. I will pass it back to Tom to talk about that's, one opportunity for how to get involved, sort of concretely. And I'll pass it back to Tom to kind of talk about some other sort of concrete next steps that folks can take.
Sure, thank you. And I'll start with climate resilient schools just for a second, because just to give you an example, there's a group of us organizing. I live in Cambridge. There's a group organizing a team in Cambridge. Each community is in a different place, but there are dozens of communities where people are working on this. So it's a great way to get involved if you're interested in it. It has all the education connections. And I think in the document, is there a link to the spreadsheet in there, Sarah? Okay, but if you fill out the form, you'll get that.
Yes.
There's a whole spreadsheet. If you go to one of the meetings of the Climate Resilient Schools Coalition, there's typically 80 people or more from around the state planning how to do this in their districts. And one of the things I love about it is that you can work locally and get something done. And that's part of what I wanted to say about how to be involved. Is there are lots of ways to get involved, and you can be involved in any scale from your neighborhood to the entire globe. But usually it works better to start locally. That's where you make connections. That's where you feel supported. That's where you make friends, and that's what helps build things. And, that could be a local chapter of a larger organization. You'll see in the links we sent out that many of the big organizations have either state chapters. Some of them we didn't even try to list the chapters because they have so many local ones, like Mothers Out Front has chapters all over the state. So you can get involved in, certainly in MTA Climate Action Network. For all of us who are MTA members, that's a piece that we can work on, and Ferd described all the different things that MTA CAN is doing. And we talked about Elders Climate Action and Third Act, both of which happen to be very active in Massachusetts. If you want to look, so those links are in what's being sent out. You can contact any organization, you will be welcomed. And if you're not sure, I think what Sarah said is really important. About, you get there and you go, wait, are these my people? Is this what I really want to do? Or is this not quite it? And if it's not quite it, look at something else. That's fine. Because there's so many options. And Ferd just put that in the chat, exactly what I was about to say, which is that if you want to get involved in your local community, the name of the local group varies from town to town, but it's the energy committee, it's the sustainability committee. Some towns have sustainability coordinators. Some towns, through a state program called MVP, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, have kind of people who work on resilience for the town. Where do we need a flood barrier? Where do we need to make sure that when there's a storm, the trees don't take down our power lines, whatever. But there's somebody working on that for the town. And the universal experience that I've heard is that when you contact people who are working for your community, they are delighted to hear from interested citizens. And they want to tell you all about what they're doing and help you figure out how to be involved. They don't regard it as a bother. So those local connections, sustainability committee, sustainability coordinator, maybe if you can't find somebody else, look for the Conservation Commission in your town. Those are all ways to get involved. And then in addition to the climate specific groups, there are bigger groups like Sierra Club and bigger Environmental Defense Fund, bigger organizations that do environmental work. And there's very few environmental organizations that are not at the moment as part of their work doing climate work. So you can kind of be part of something in your local community, even just in your neighborhood. You can be part of climate resilient schools, which is district by district. You can be part of a local chapter of a bigger organization. There are all these options, and a lot happens from that. And I'll give you one example that I know about, actually a couple. Anybody in the western part of the state might know about this, that there was a proposal for a wood burning power plant in Springfield. And when it was originally proposed, this was supposed to be an environmental and jobs win. And 13 years later, the permit was revoked. The plant was not built. And the reason was that the local community got together and said, we don't want this because it's going to put out all this particulate matter. And Springfield has, I think, the second highest asthma rate in the country. And they won, and it became state policy. And this was something that local people working in their community for their community shifted things for the whole state. And that's not an uncommon story. Any of you who have seen the geothermal pilot plants being done in Framingham and I think Andover, I don't remember where the other one is, that were started by an organization called HEAT, H-E-E-T. That organization started because two Cambridge moms were talking to each other on the street. That's the origin of the idea.
Tom, if I could add two quick comments about the biomass plant. So
Okay.
part of how the opposition mobilized it, a whole lot of us went to our town meeting. So I don't usually go to my town meeting, but I went, I spoke, I brought a resolution, town meeting voted, we don't want the biomass plant, even though we're 40 miles away, it would still impact my town. And what I just heard is that even though we won, it's now, they're trying to sneak it back in. Not that plant, but the idea that biomass can be considered a renewable source, which of course it isn't.
Right. So anyway, so there are lots and lots of ways to get involved, find what fits for you. And I don't know, Sarah or Ferd, do you want to add anything else to that, either specifically or generally?
I think you guys have covered it.
I mean, that's really what we wanted to get to, is what can you do? And there, look for what needs doing. This is from these three criteria are from a climate scientist named Diana Elizabeth Johnson. Look for what needs doing, look for what you're good at, and look for what makes you happy. What it needs doing, what can you contribute, and what's going to make you feel connected, feel energized, feel engaged. And that's going to be different for each person, but there's so many options.